All right, so today's topic is preparing for college admissions in the era of COVID-19. As you're probably aware, there's a lot of anxiety going on right now because there's so many different changes going on, right? So it's almost like every single day there's something new in the news about how colleges are responding to or changing their policies because of coronavirus. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these. So I do want to disclaimer that we do want you to refrain from recording any of the information in this seminar. We may, I believe we'll have a YouTube version of this seminar available for a limited time if you missed any of the information. All right, so first, before we jump into the specifics, I want to kind of dive into the typical selection criteria used by colleges traditionally, right? So for this one, I'm going to use a university like UC Irvine. So we could see typically that these are the factors that UC Irvine looks at when they're evaluating an applicant. As you can see at the very top, the most important ones are the academic factors, things like the rigor of the secondary school record. In other words, how hard are your classes? Do you have like honors or AP classes or IB classes, or are you taking just regular classes? So obviously that's pretty important. Many schools these days don't factor in class rank anymore. If your high school does, then of course that is going to be a factor that they would consider, right? If it's a college that actually rates it as being important. The GPA, both weighted and unweighted, if both are available, will be considered. Okay, as will your standardized test scores. The application essay is obviously very important. And if the school allows them, because in this case the UCs don't accept recommendation letters, then the recommendation letters are part of the academic profile. For the non-academic profile, obviously things like extracurricular activities, but indirectly things like talents and abilities or your character or personal qualities are also looked at and scrutinized, usually indirectly because they'll be gauging this based on what people talk about you as a student, based on the recommendations, based on what you say about yourself in the essays, right? So there are ways to indirectly gauge things like talents or your character. Okay. Some other factors, depending on the school, they may factor in whether or not you're a first generation college student, whether or not you're the child of an alumnus or an alumna, right? So these are like what are called like legacy cases, right? So for some private universities, being a child of someone who attended their university, especially for undergrad, right? If your parents attended undergrad there, it's potentially going to help you get into their college. Okay. Sometimes colleges also focus on geographical residence in the sense that they do want to have a little bit more diversity in their campuses. So that's something that they factor in as well. But they'll also look at some other factors. Obviously, for non-religious schools, they don't really factor in religious affiliation. Even religious schools, though, for the most part, they're not going to necessarily sort of like uh, choose against you simply because you're not part of the religion of whatever the institution is, right? And of course, race or ethnic status, because the UCs technically at this moment, since ACA 5 is just being proposed and it's not necessarily something that's been passed just yet, for this instance, the UCs don't factor race or ethnic status, but a lot of private schools do, right? A lot of private schools will use affirmative action in order to help add more underrepresented minorities to their incoming class. Okay, and then of course other things like volunteer work, very important these days. And we're going to talk about the importance of volunteering as we go through the seminar, and work experience if you have it. And then lastly, some colleges rarely do factor in as well, like the level of the applicant's interest. I think this is more a factor though for schools that are like safer schools for a lot of students. They will factor in a little bit more whether or not you've shown demonstrated interest in wanting to attend their institution. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the key trends that have happened right now, right? So the first one we'll notice is that there's less emphasis on standardized testing. This is pretty obvious because a lot of schools are aware that SAT and ACT dates have been canceled left and right. Most recently, the August test date. Some of the students were fortunate enough to take the test today, this morning, right? But many testing centers, had their administrations or the test date today canceled because they felt like the location was unsafe. Okay, so that's going to be something that we're going to monitor very closely. Our teachers and counselors are very much aware of what the latest trends are, and so we'll be informing our students based on when it's safe to go ahead and take the test and which testing centers they can register at. Okay. One of the other curveballs that have been thrown the way of colleges now is that many schools have gone pass fail or credit no credit for the past spring semester, but they may do so again in the fall. Okay, some school districts are still in the process of debating whether or not they're going to go back to a traditional grading system for this fall. Okay. One other thing too is that clubs and activities have been severely limited. Okay. Yes, high schools are trying to find ways to have like their various clubs a little bit more active, things that can be ported easily to an online format. But unfortunately, things like competitive sports, it's going to be very difficult for students to participate in those things if they cannot be outdoors, right? Some colleges might be facing financial difficulties because of all the impact of coronavirus, and they may not have as many applicants because some students have opted not to re-enroll or they chose not to apply, right? And that might have some sort of bearing as well in terms of what colleges might make available. As you probably heard in the news, a lot of universities have shifted to online courses, right? Although they probably kept the tuition the same because they needed to maintain their operations. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to notice is that there's going to be a little bit more of a trend of some students choosing to stay closer to home. So instead of applying to some out-of-state college, they may just want to stay closer to home because they feel safer or because it's relatively cheaper to go to an in-state school. And that could open up potentially more slots for more selective schools. Okay, but on a counterbalancing note, there were also quite a few students who decided to take a gap year last year, which means they're now going to be entering this class. So that might also limit a little bit the number of slots available. So it's remains to be seen. We're going to keep a close eye on how these things will develop in terms of whether or not it's actually going to help students get in much more easily this year, or whether or not it's going to be a little bit harder. I would say there's going to be a little bit of both, but I would say there's definitely going to be more of an opportunity this year than there has been in previous years. Okay. One of the key changes, because of things we mentioned above, with there being less emphasis on standardized testing because of the test optional policies, and because a lot of schools going pass fail, admissions officers will have a lot more leeway and discretion in terms of how they're supposed to evaluate students, right? So which means now they're going to be looking at more qualitative factors. They're going to be looking at the student's character. They're going to look at their intellectual curiosity and their passion for learning. These are some of the buzzwords that I've heard from my contacts in admissions, right? So instead of looking at the traditional numbers factors as closely as they have been in the past, there's going to be a little bit more of an emphasis on other factors to counterbalance that. Okay, so let's take a look one by one. So I want to focus first on the academic factor because, as I mentioned earlier, that's still the number one criterion. That's still the one that colleges will be looking at most closely, right? All right, so the first thing is that the transcript is still the most important factor, but not just the pure GPA. Colleges will also be looking at the rigor of your coursework, right? Which means they will be considering you based on how difficult your classes were, whether or not you're taking challenging honors or AP or IB courses, right? That will be something that they will be looking at as well. However, as in the past, colleges are very aware that it's not an even playing field, right? Some high schools will have more access to AP or IB courses, and so they'll be looking at things in the context of what a student was able to achieve within the opportunities that were made available to them, right? So I think some parents, some students, they get really apprehensive sometimes, especially if they're just starting high school, because they start to compare themselves to friends in other high schools and they notice, oh, my friend has APs available even as early as freshman year. Okay, why don't I have that? Is that going to hurt my chances? Okay, colleges will look at things based on what was in your high school profile, right? Your counselor will send a profile of what was available at your high school. They will know also historically how competitive and rigorous your high school is, right? So they'll be able to judge whether or not you were able to do a really great job, even though you didn't have as many opportunities as maybe someone who attended a different high school. Now, to be fair though, they will prioritize students who excelled at a high level at very competitive high schools because they know it's a lot harder to do well in a high school that's much, much more competitive. Okay. Now, colleges will also, because of those pass-fail, credit, no credit semesters, they'll have to look a little bit more closely at the semesters with the grades. Okay, so which means if a student, say for example, struggled first semester last year and then they have pass-fail, this year will actually be much, much more important for colleges to see whether or not they're able to rebound from that and whether or not they can actually show evidence that they can perform at a high level, especially taking classes that are very rigorous. Okay. And so grades will actually be even more important than in previous years because of the fact that many schools are aware that it's going to be difficult for students to get their testing in. And so because schools are going to be test optional for at least the next year or two, right? Some have even said that they're going to extend the experiment for up to like 3 years, right? That's even more important to be able to demonstrate your performance in academics first and foremost, right? So that's number one in terms of the criterion that colleges will be looking at. Okay, so what's going to happen with these pass-fail semesters? What's the story with this? Okay, so colleges will consider your transcript as a whole, like I said, based on the context of what was available, which means a little bit more weight is probably going to be put on those semesters where you did have grades. Okay, however, courses that have been labeled as pass, fail, or credit, no credit will still be able to satisfy course requirements. It's not necessarily just because you won't get a grade, they won't necessarily count them. They will still count these classes as far as satisfying your math requirements, your foreign language requirements, making sure that you have enough science or English classes. That's still going to be counted. You're still taking the semester in their eyes, okay? Now, however, given that many students have now had one less semester of grades, possibly two if some high schools decide to continue their pass-fail policies for this semester, I normally recommend considering taking extra graded coursework, right? So this could be done by taking online courses through various like universities, taking it, sometimes it's even available within the school district. They'll make some high school level courses available, right? But of course, much like colleges are more impressed with an AP class versus a regular class, that's why we highly advise students to consider, if they can handle it, taking a college level course. And I'll talk about some samples or some ways that students can do that in a little bit, okay? So if there is an option, if a high school gives an option to go either pass, fail, or have a letter grade, we do recommend getting a letter grade if a student knows that they can do pretty well in the class, of course, okay? All right, so what are some things you can do to improve your chances, improve your grades, right? So how do you strengthen the academic record, okay? So the first thing we recommend is taking additional college level coursework. And HS2 has been really in front of this and tried to find opportunities for students to be able to take college coursework, right? And so we've partnered up with UC Riverside to offer UC transcript graded courses, right? And the great thing about these is that these courses all satisfy general education requirements for all the UCs, right? So if a student were to take a UC Riverside course through HS2, they'll not only be getting a graded course at the same level as an AP weighted semester, but they'll also at the same time be able to satisfy general ed requirements for a lot of, well, actually all the UCs should be able to transfer over these credits, okay? And the great thing about these courses is that they're exclusive to HS2 students. So, you know, your son or daughter doesn't have to feel a little bit out of place or a bit intimidated by having to take courses with college students, okay? So we've had, you know, certain course offerings right now, especially for students who are interested in like business. We have an intro to business course. There's even a course on smartphone app development, right? And another course on, I believe there's one for race and ethnicity, right? Which, especially in these times when there's a lot more awareness about things going on, about like racial tensions, it shows colleges a lot about a student's priorities and about their awareness of the world around them if they were to take a course like that. Okay. Now, of course, there are also opportunities to take classes at like a local community college, but you know, one of the risks of that is that you'd have to check whether or not those units will actually transfer, right? And as I said earlier, it's a little bit harder because the students will be taking classes with actual college students or college age students, which sometimes is a little intimidating for students and they may not necessarily be able to perform at their best, okay? What's also important to realize is that not every course you take has to necessarily be related to your major. Colleges love to see that students have intellectual curiosity about a whole range of other topics, right? So even if, say, for example, a student were interested in engineering, taking a class on race and ethnicity or a philosophy class or a different foreign language can show that a student is actually much more curious and eager to learn things beyond just their major. And in fact, actually colleges are already designed that way, right? So your major only counts for maybe like a third to maybe a half at most of what the courses that you take in college. The rest, they encourage you to take a broad range of other courses. So being able to take college courses even in high school that show a range of interests is actually going to help you out quite a lot. Okay. Now, even if you don't sign up for credit courses, there are options, especially for students that are not sure whether or not they can do well in a college type format. You can also take like free online courses through edX or Coursera or platforms like that. Now, of course, the downside is that you're not getting college credits. It's not actually helping your GPA. But if you just wanted to do that to sort of learn something new, we also advise students to go ahead and take advantage of certain courses like that because it'll help show evidence that you're interested in your major down the line. Okay, that might be a nice like first step to get your feet wet with like different content other than school, and then eventually take a class that's for college credits. Okay. All right, so the next topic we'll be discussing is standardized testing. And obviously there are a lot of changes going on with this, okay? So the first thing is, how has coronavirus impacted standardized testing? Well, there's the obvious, right? So a lot of colleges, because they're aware that a lot of test dates have now been canceled, are shifting towards being test optional. But let's examine what that means exactly, right? So if a college goes test optional, it means that you can still submit an SAT or ACT score if you so choose, right? Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't care about SAT or ACT anymore. If you actually have a pretty high SAT or ACT score, we still highly suggest that you send that score in because it'll distinguish you more from other candidates, right? So one example here is that the UC system has now gone test optional for this application year and next year. After that, for the next 2 years, they're actually not even considering SAT anymore, right? Until they replace it with their own UC test. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a few slides, okay? Now, we do still recommend that you send in test scores if you feel like they'll help your case. And this is especially going to be true for certain students. For instance, if they don't have necessarily good grades, then we highly suggest that they do much better in standardized testing to sort of counterbalance or offset their performance in their GPA. Now, of course, a very, very high SAT score will not completely make up for bad grades, but at least it'll help sort of give a different context and maybe allow colleges to feel like a student may have some higher potential that they haven't really tapped yet, okay? It's also important to realize, though, that if a student were to go test optional, we only recommend they do that if their grades are really strong, right? So in the past, when we've seen data on students who've gotten accepted to schools that are test optional, we found that the most successful ones already had like perfect or nearly perfect grades, right? So that was the way to counteract the fact that they're not reporting any tests, because that way they're helping the college have a slightly higher average GPA for their incoming class, right? So that's going to be especially true this year as well and next year. So if you can take an SAT or ACT, and if you think it can help your case, we still recommend that you do so, okay? And only go test optional if you feel like the GPA is a much stronger component of your application. So let's say you're getting a 4.0 already, and you're not sure if one, can actually take the SAT or ACT because one's not available near you, or two, because your performance on the SAT or ACT is relatively weaker, you're like not a testing person, then that might predispose you to go test optional because it might actually help your chances more than you would if you were to go with the traditional testing in addition to your grades, okay? Now, the latest news is that the August SAT date has been canceled in many test centers, but I think there's a few rare test centers where students were still able to take their test this morning, actually, right? The College Board and ACT are currently working to add more test dates and test centers to make sure that students can take it. However, if you are a younger student, if you're, say, for example, if you just started like 10th grade, possibly you're even 11th grade right now, I would actually advise that you maybe just wait until the spring once it's safer and you have more testing centers available to you, okay? One more bit of news. Some of you might have heard that a few months back, ACT had announced that they were going to allow for section retakes, where instead of retaking the entire ACT, you could simply retake certain sections, right? But because of COVID and everything, they had to push back the plans for that until next year, right? So you would not be able to avail of this opportunity to simply retake one section at a time this year, right? You'd have to wait until next year. All right, so what about SAT subject tests? That's another component that colleges had looked at in the past, okay? So right now, because they're aware that it's already bad enough that students can't take the SAT or ACT when they need to, many schools have now downgraded their requirements for SAT subject tests, right? So instead of saying that they recommend that you submit them, they're making them entirely optional, and you can submit whichever ones you want to if you think it's going to help your case, right? But many colleges still recommend it, though, for certain majors, like if you're going for engineering or something very technical, to submit at least like the math score. They might still recommend the physics score, but it's not such a big requirement as it once was. So the key thing here is that if you already have high subject test scores, you probably should send them. But if you're still struggling to take your SAT or ACT, you haven't found the time to do that, prioritize that first, right? Because there will still be schools that would still require SAT or ACT, even although a lot of schools are going test optional. So it still makes more sense for you to prioritize SAT 1 or ACT first, okay? One bit of news, some schools are actually no longer requiring or even looking at subject tests, right? So most notably, MIT, Yale, Swarthmore, and Harvey Mudd are some of the big names that have now said that, hey, we're not even going to look at subject tests anymore because we feel like it's not helping us necessarily, or it doesn't add a significant factor for them to evaluate whether or not a student is qualified to attend. Okay, so at this point, it's removed as a factor. So they don't even want you to send it at all at this point. Okay, for certain schools. All right, so what about AP and IB exams, right? So if you have children who take the test, or if you're students who had taken the AP test this past May, you know that it was kind of chaotic, right? Some tests got canceled, some tests basically, you know, there were some technical issues, so students needed to kind of like have their test rescored because they think it was unfairly graded. So one of the key things is that colleges will be a lot more understanding this year and possibly next year of you choosing simply not to report your AP exams. So I would still highly suggest that you self-report and send them in, but a lot of schools don't even need you to send in your AP scores when you apply anyway. They only want your scores at the end of 12th grade. So if you feel like your scores can help you, then we advise you to put it on your applications, both your Common App and your UC application. However, if you feel like it wasn't a fair reflection of your performance, then you could just opt not to put it down there, and colleges won't really worry too much about it because they know that it's been really unusual this past May or so. Okay, now this past spring, IB tests weren't offered, right? They simply said that they were going to evaluate students based on their IB coursework, right, and grades. But they may, I think I've heard that they might try to do what AP did and come up with some sort of online testing for IB this coming spring, right? So we'll wait to see on that one, and we'll update you whether or not that actually took place or whether or not they found ways to do that. Okay. All right. So what should you do now to improve your chances? Well, the first thing we want you to do is to go ahead and still prepare for SAT 1 or ACT this school year, especially if you believe that it can if you can still raise your score and if it can be something that helps your application, okay? Even though some schools are test optional, like I mentioned earlier, you would need really, really high grades to be competitive for test optional anyway. So if you choose not to submit a test, then you really need to make sure that your grades are perfect or nearly perfect, okay? If you need to prioritize, focus your time on SAT 1 or ACT instead of subject tests. We do have quite a lot of course offerings for SAT and ACT. We'll be offering them throughout the school year, and our instructors are actually, you know, some of the best in the industry. We've had, you know, teachers who graduated from top schools like Stanford, UPenn, okay, MIT. So we have teachers who are very much content experts in their subjects for SAT and ACT, and they've been doing this for many years, right? So one of the key things we also recommend is for students to constantly check up on SAT and ACT test dates to see when it's available. There's also been talk that they will eventually come up with at-home versions, but there's also complications with that because it's a lot harder to be able to add security and prevent cheating from an online test that you take at home. So at this point, you know, it remains to be seen whether or not ACT and College Board will be able to come up with a version that's a little bit more secure that allows you to take the test from home. All right, so now let's talk about activities and why they're so important. Okay, so your college activities, of course, will also be something that's going to be scrutinized quite closely, right? Simply because now that SAT scores or grades have become a little bit less important because of like pass fail and because of test optional, your activities are going to be a bigger factor that colleges are going to be scrutinizing. Right. So one of the big changes right now, and students are seeing this now in the fall, is that a lot of clubs and activities are now inactive or they're very much scaled back, right? So thankfully, there are still clubs and activities that are ongoing. So one example is I have a daughter right now who does speech and debate, And it's very much still thriving as an activity because they were able to do like online tournaments and students can still participate online. However, some activities are not quite as fortunate, right? Some activities that require more like in-person interaction. So the biggest hits, of course, like I mentioned earlier, are going to be like athletic activities, right? Sports going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to do from home, obviously, right? So that's going to be something that's going to limit the amount of choices that people have, right? So one of the key things then that colleges will be scrutinizing when they look at your activities is how did you take advantage of the situation, or how did you sort of like adapt to all the changing circumstances with not having as many clubs? Because many students are going to be complacent and simply sit at home and say like, well, they have no clubs, so there's nothing I can do. I'm just going to sit at home and just study for my classes because that's the only thing I can do, right? Now, those students may not fare as well as students who do take that extra step and that initiative to do things on their own, right? And we'll talk about what things you can do for that later, right? Colleges are now saying that they're going to be looking very closely at character, right? And this is also in light of all the college scandals that have rocked the admissions world over the last couple of years, right? So they know that many students are focused on just trying to cheat their way into college. And so there's been a shift or movement now towards looking at students based on their values, their character, their ability to help out their community. So community service is going to be a much, much more important factor now than it has been in previous years, right? As is demonstrated qualities, through things like your recommendation letters, right? So being able to show your teachers and your counselor at school that you're just generally a very nice person, you're very caring and generous and compassionate, that's going to go a long way to help you stand out more versus other students, okay? Um, One of the things too is that some students have been unfortunate in the fact that, like, especially for the last summer, some of their activities have been canceled, right? So if students were, say, for example, accepted to very competitive or prestigious summer programs, they can still report that on the Common Application and the UC application, but they just need to note that that program was somehow canceled, right? So for this upcoming summer, though, hopefully if things normalize by next summer, then students can go back to applying for and trying to do things like internships or research or other more competitive summer programs. But for now, at least, it's incumbent on students to be really creative in terms of what they can do for their activities, okay? So one of the things we encourage students to do as well is that even though informal club activities aren't taking place at school, they can still track what they're doing related to their activities, right? And they can go ahead and put that, we normally advise that they put that on like a spreadsheet somewhere where they track what they're doing for volunteering, what they're doing for various clubs, so that when they report these to colleges later on, that they still have a record of that and they can give accurate sort of estimates in terms of the number of hours they spent doing certain activities. All right, so what options do you have now? Okay, so one of the things that we encourage students to do is to keep actively looking for online volunteer opportunities. There are some simple ones, like you can write cards or emails to residents at senior centers, or you can solicit donations for COVID-19 victims, right? We also encourage students to informally contact club members from their school and try to see if they can still organize club activities, even if it's not necessarily officially sanctioned by the school, right? Students can just meet through online platforms like Zoom, right? They can have a Zoom meeting. I think there's an online software called Discord, which used to be used primarily for like gaming, but I think a lot of students are now using it to meet online because there are things like forums or chat places where they can kind of like talk about certain activities, and you can actually have like video meetings like we do here in Zoom, right? So a lot of students have used Discord as a way for them to keep engaged in and constantly participating in certain activities. Okay. Now, certain hobbies, right? Some students find inventive ways to pass the time, especially if they're stuck at home all the time, right? So that could be something too that you can do for your college applications, right? You can come up with new hobbies, right? So if you've always been interested in like learning how to knit, right? You can watch YouTube videos and teach yourself how to knit, right? You can do things like arts and crafts where you can build models of things. That could be something too that you can put in your college applications eventually. Okay, it's especially also important that if you can help out your family during tough times, this could also be input on your college applications. Let's say, for example, because some of the parents have been laid off, or maybe they've scaled back in the amount of work they have to do. They maybe had to get a second job, right? And that limits the time they can do things at home, like helping helping take care of younger siblings, that could be something that students can put down on their applications as well that would make them look really good to colleges and show a lot of character because it shows like maturity and responsibility, things that colleges love to see. Okay. We also suggest maintaining a journal, right, to record your experiences during these unusual times, because by the time you're ready to apply for colleges, having a record of these things where you can look back and talk about like the different things that you experienced during these last few months can be very, very important in terms of, distinguishing yourself from other applicants when you're finally writing your college application essays. Okay, so some of the unique offerings that HS2 Academy has to help students find meaningful activities are the following, right? So HS2 has been partnering with UC Riverside to develop online internships for students interested in working for international nonprofits, right? And this is great because it sort of serves in two categories. One, it's kind of like a form of job training because you're learning how to work under or for a nonprofit, okay? But at the same time, it also counts for volunteering because you're doing some things, it's unpaid, and you're doing things to help out society in some way, right? So it definitely is going to look great for colleges to have activities like this to show that you're eager to make a global impact, right? There are also volunteering opportunities through HS2. In fact, HS2 has a nonprofit wing called Compassionate Scholars, and we partnered up with the American Cancer Society to have these projects for students to lead, right? So the current one is called Love Notes Around the World, where students can go ahead and create projects to give things to like little gifts to cancer patients and people working in the healthcare field who are treating cancer patients, right? But down the line, we have other opportunities too. There are things for like music, for instance. There are things to help out with COVID patients or helping out the elderly. So we're coming up with new opportunities and new ideas for students to be able to get some volunteer hours during this time, especially since there's a limited number maybe available through their school. Okay. Also, in addition to the coursework that I mentioned for UCR, right? So we have those 3 courses. There's one on critical thinking, intro to business, and the course on smart app development or smartphone app development. There's also a unique offering for HS2 students to earn a certificate in specialized study in diversity and multiculturalism, right? So this is paired up with a course on race and ethnicity, but it also has other elements like there's a seminar and there's also like an internship-based thing that ties into this, okay? And lastly, for STEM-oriented students, HS2 is going to be offering in the next few weeks or so a medical research internship or apprenticeship, right, in which students will learn about molecular modeling, and this course is taught by a PhD who had worked 30 plus years in the pharmaceutical industry, right? And after the course, which will last for about 3 weeks, they'll be engaging in research. They'll be learning how to use a computer to model various molecules that could be used for things like drug treatments in the future, right? So it's especially helpful in its own right because it's research that students can show that they're more advanced than other students who are interested maybe in sciences or computer science or engineering, right? But it's also a stepping stone for other research opportunities in the future, okay? Either with HS2 or if they're applying to like summer research programs like RSI at MIT, for instance, right? Which is a very popular and very highly competitive program, right? So having some research experiences and some skill sets under students' belt can help make them more competitive for other research opportunities down the line. Okay, so let's briefly talk about the changes for UC admissions now. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, so one of the big changes is that because they're aware that many schools have gone pass-fail for semester, there may be a limited number of semesters that the UCs can look at now to evaluate a student's GPA, right? So especially for students who are now just entering like 11th grade, that means that many students have lost one of the 4 semesters that they can be used to calculate a student's GPA, especially since many schools did have second semester 10th grade as being pass-fail. However, those courses will still satisfy the UC A through G requirements as previously mentioned, okay? But technically, any coursework that you take during 10th grade and 11th grade, even outside of school, that you can get a grade for, and even the summers after 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade also still count as part of your UC GPA. Not as many people are aware of that. So if you were to take some college coursework during this school year, in addition to your existing classes, or even some during the summer after 11th grade, that can still be factored in, and that can help raise or improve your GPA to make you look more competitive, especially since the UCs are now test optional, right? So strengthening your coursework is probably the best way that you can make yourself more competitive for top schools like the UCs, especially in light of the fact that many students may not get the opportunity to be able to do standardized testing, okay? All right, so let's talk about some of the other impacts and changes in the actual college admissions landscape, okay? So how has coronavirus impacted college admissions as a whole, right? We've seen this trend where some smaller colleges have actually shut down or really scaled back because of COVID-19. They maybe reduced their staff, they maybe reduced the number of classes available, right? However, this is less of an impact though for top 100 schools like larger universities with deeper and healthier endowments, right? Because they can still sort of like tap into that to be able to help them through these rough next year or two, okay? However, because many schools might have certain budget problems, there may be restricted majors. There might be certain majors that are a little bit more competitive now because there are, there's fewer courses available, fewer instructors to teach those classes. So we'll be looking at that closely in terms of which majors have, potentially been impacted from a lot of top schools, okay? As I mentioned earlier, there are some surveys that are not now indicating that students may just choose to stay closer to home or take gap years. And so that might help some students, but it also might hurt them because the seniors from last year may be taking a gap year and will be included in this class. However, that's also offset because some students this year who are applying now may also choose to take a gap year. So colleges are keenly aware that there might be some shuffling in terms of students sort of like pushing forward their college years. But there will be, though, a predicted drop off simply because there just wouldn't be enough international students applying. That's definitely going to be a thing that colleges will be very much aware of. And so because they know that they're going to have fewer applicants from other countries who are scared of going to the US for college, that does present a little bit more of an opportunity for certain students. Okay, so there will be certain students though who will be just taking a shot at top schools even if they're not qualified. There's going to be a little bit of that. But the number of very competitive students may actually decrease as a result, and that might present a unique opportunity if you're already a very qualified student and you want to try to get into some of these top schools, okay? All right, so, how can this improve your chances? Yes, right? So what we're foreseeing right now is that this will probably result in an uptick, maybe a slight uptick in the acceptance rates of top schools. We already saw that this past year, actually, right? Some schools have had to, or ended up increasing their acceptance rates because they knew ahead of time that because of COVID, some people may not choose to enroll this year, right? So they'd have to up the acceptance rate so that they have a bigger pool of people to select from so they can still field an incoming class. Okay, there may also be a greater use of wait lists this year, right? Just because colleges want to see how the incoming class fares and whether or not they might have a lot of students who choose not to attend. They want to have a bigger wait list to draw from. So there may be even more students on the wait list this year than in previous years. Okay. So one of the key things that we tell students, though, is that one of the ways that you can set yourself apart is by having, showing a lot of initiative, right, either in your clubs or volunteering, so that you can set yourself apart, and then that would make you even more competitive, especially in this time where it's very unpredictable, right? That's your best bet, is just showing that you are still a very top active student at this time. Okay, now, a word about writing essays about things that are happening during, the COVID months. If you have a compelling story because of everything that has happened with COVID, that may definitely help your case, right, when it comes to setting yourself apart for the application process. But remember, there are also always going to be students who are more severely impacted by COVID. So if you're writing about things like, oh, I got stuck at home and I wasn't able to do my clubs or activities, that may not necessarily set you apart as much as someone who did have some genuine issues. There are people who've had parents lose their jobs. There have parents who've even had loved ones and family members pass away, unfortunately, because of COVID. Okay. One of the other things that we caution you about too is that admissions officers may actually suffer from what I call COVID fatigue. There are just way too many people writing about COVID potentially that they may just get really kind of sick and tired of it. They may get so inundated with all these stories about COVID that even though they're sympathetic and even though they're trying their best to go ahead and understand what's going on, if there are too many essays written about it, that can actually also hurt your chances too. So what we do is, like, as counselors, counselors, we help students to evaluate whether or not it's a compelling story that you want to tell, or whether or not you're better off just focusing on some other essay topics that would distinguish you more from everybody else who's going to write essays about things that are going on with COVID. Okay. All right, some final tips for students especially, right? So as I mentioned earlier, you want to be proactive about trying to improve your profile. Stay engaged, which means if you can, consider seriously taking extra coursework, especially college coursework, if you think that can actually help your transcript. Okay, continue to still prepare for the SAT or ACT, because many schools, even though there are a lot of test optional schools, many schools will still require them. Okay. You can use this time to also research colleges and taking advantage of things like virtual tours and info sessions, right? Because, going to colleges and visiting them to see if you'd like to go there, it's not a thing anymore, right? It's extremely difficult to do that these days, right? So finding other ways to inform yourself about colleges is still very important, because if you can show colleges that you know a lot about them, beyond just what's on their, the first page of their website, it's going to be able to distinguish you more if you can show that you're very much passionate and interested about the colleges. Okay, a couple of final points here. Recommendation letters will be even more important than in previous years, simply because they're going to be tapping into and really relying on the teachers as a way to evaluate which students are more qualified than others, right? So they'll take the teacher's word about like who are their best students, who they consider the ones to be, have greater potential to do well in college, right? So keep fostering those good relationships with your teachers, even though it's going to be more difficult this year because, everything's online for the most part, right? Some schools are now on site, but for the vast majority of schools, I think they're still doing it online. So it's even more challenging for you to be able to kind of like do well, get your teacher's attention, contribute to the classroom discussion, but it still can be done, right? So smart students will find ways to be able to still impress their teachers. I would say always being on top of the reading, asking smart questions in class, those are always good ways to really impress your teachers. And then finally, actively seek new opportunities to impact your community or grow as a person. Okay, you can find new hobbies, you can challenge yourself by finding new ways to volunteer and help out your community. Okay, even if it's remote or online, there's so many wonderful things that you can do to help impact your community. Okay, so with that, I'd like to open it for Q&A. So if you have any questions for me, feel free to go ahead and type it directly in the Q&A box, and I'll be here for the next maybe 10 or 15 minutes to answer any remaining questions that you have. Okay, so the first question here is, what will the application process look like for LAC in our opinions? LAC, do you mean liberal arts colleges? Okay, so for liberal arts colleges, I think especially for smaller and less competitive liberal arts colleges, they're the ones who are probably going to take the most hits. So that's probably going to predispose it more favorably upon students who do have maybe the ability to pay for full tuition, right? Liberal arts colleges may also, depending on like things like location, there might be fewer people applying this year because it's more remote, for instance, right? So I don't think there's going to be a massive difference though in terms of liberal arts colleges as opposed to like other major universities in terms of how the application process will look, right? So still the same thing. I think liberal arts colleges have been pretty much at the forefront of being test optional for many, many years. In fact, there are more liberal arts who've been test optional before COVID. And so they've already sort of fine-tuned their evaluation process. So they're a little bit more attuned towards which students will be able to do well in, okay? All right. So some other things that, okay, so another question here is, should I submit SAT math score of 720 and chemistry score of 750? I'm CS major, there's no subject test in September, otherwise it'll be too late to take October SAT. So Joe, it depends largely on which schools you're applying to, right? So for certain schools, a math score of 720 might be a little bit low because of the percentile of that will be below the 50th percentile. And so depending on the colleges, depending on how competitive they are, it may not necessarily be as impressive, whereas the chemistry score of 750 would be. So I would probably send that out, okay? But a lot depends on the context of the rest of your profile, your grades and whatnot, okay? Sorry, just as a disclaimer, please type it in the Q&A box instead of the chat box. I'll try to answer the ones in the chat as well, but it's easier for me to be able to answer the questions in one spot, okay? All right, so next question is, should I do early action for my schools if your GPA is below their average GPA? In general, I recommend that you go ahead and just do regular decision if your GPA is a little bit lower for early action, because their natural instinct in admissions is to wait and see how you end up doing for first semester of senior year, okay? I mean, if it's just purely early action, you could probably take a shot at one or two, because early action is not restrictive with each other. You can apply to multiple schools for early action, right? But if you're applying early decision, then you may want to consider like going for a school that's within target range, but not necessarily too far out. Because if it's a dream school and it's too far out, you probably will end up getting deferred, most likely, if not outright rejected. Okay, so next question is, my daughter's not good at any sports. Will that negatively affect her college application? She's good academically though. Like I mentioned earlier, it's probably not really going to impact it all that much because colleges are aware, especially these days, that many students will not get the opportunity to participate in sports. So no, it's probably not going to hurt her one bit, to be honest. As long as she is, as long as she has a well-rounded list of other activities, I would only recommend sports in your profile if you're actually pretty competitive and you're pretty good at it. Okay. Next one, which of the following normally has the highest acceptance rate in the UCs? Electrical, computer science, EECS, CE, ECE. It depends largely by campus, I'll be honest, right? So, you know, some don't even have those variants. I would say, you know, electrical engineering and computer science tends to be usually the most rigorous. Other than that, there's really not much variety in there in terms of the EECS spectrum. So I think they would all probably have fairly similar acceptance rates. So that's definitely something that you can ask our counselors once you actually have the list of each UC campus. We'll be actually able to break down for you which one has the easier acceptance rates. But in general, though, most UC campuses don't necessarily break down their admissions rates by specific major. That's actually a myth, right? Usually it's by the college or the school, which means Berkeley's College of Engineering generally has a College of Engineering acceptance rate, not necessarily an EECS only acceptance rate. Okay, so getting in largely is dependent on which college you go to, if it's letters and sciences or College of Engineering, not necessarily based on did you pick CE or EE or EECS, right? Do we have to submit all AP scores? As I mentioned earlier, no, right? So you've always been able to self-report AP scores. So if you wanted to sort of withhold certain AP scores, you totally can, right? In fact, colleges only really want your official AP scores at the end of the process once you're done with all the different things that you've been doing, right? So like end of senior year, once you're done with those APs, that's when you send it in. So it's all really just self-reported. As a general rule of thumb though, I say like if you got a 3 or above, you may as well put in your application. If you got a 1 or a 2, it's debatable whether or not you want to put it there, especially if you're not going to get any credits anyway, okay? Next question is, does the child have to take College Board AP test in May if he or she is taking AP class at school? There's no downside in taking it, right? Because you can always not send in the score if you don't think it's a good score. So I would still say take the test anyway, because there's always still a chance that you can actually do pretty well on those tests, okay? Next one, how detailed should volunteer activity logs or journals be? Well, for the most part, yeah, I mean, if you have a simple spreadsheet where you logged in, this is this date, these are the hours I did, and this is what I did, right? Just brief description, I think that's fine, right? HS2 is a certifying organization for the Presidential Volunteer Award. So having something like that can also be helpful when we're helping you file for an application for those volunteer hours, right? So the more detailed you can give, typically the better. Okay, so Jerry asks, is psychology a competitive major for the UCs? It depends on the campus. I think psychology can be an impacted major in certain UC campuses, for instance, right? So I know for like UCLA, it's a little bit more impacted than in other UCs, right? So it largely depends on the campus. Okay, so the next question is, what do you mean by the rigor of the secondary school record? So rigor simply means the difficulty level, right? So when they evaluate a student's transcript, they're looking overall as to how competitive your classes overall are, right? So if you only had regular classes, even if you're getting straight A's, but you only really had like 1 or 2 APs for the entirety of high school, that's not nearly as impressive as maybe someone who did get a couple of B's, even if they didn't get straight A's, but they took like 7 or 8 to 10 APs because they know that it's much more challenging to get good grades with a more difficult schedule. I mean, obviously colleges want the best of both worlds. They want a student who's taking very, very challenging classes and still getting as close to straight A's as possible. So I think it's kind of like a balancing act. You do want to be able to kind of like have a nice mix of having rigorous classes and taking the most challenging classes that you think you can handle and still being able to do as well as you can and get straight A's if possible. Okay, let's see if there are any other questions here. Um, so as far as the application process goes, HS2 can help you with a whole range of different options, right? We can help you apply to private schools. We also have a package for UC-only applications if you're only interested in applying to the UCs, okay? Cal State applications as well, we can help out, especially because this year more than ever, Cal States want to see your various activities. So it's not just because the Cal States don't have an essay that, you know, it's not like you don't need any help filling out the Cal State application. We find that in the past, having someone as a strategist to help you fill out both the UC and the Cal State application can help your overall application be more competitive. Okay. Next question. What should I do if my counselor has lowered my course rigor this semester? Okay, well, one of the things you could do is you can talk to your counselor about trying to see if you can take more competitive classes, right? So maybe try to see if you can sign up for an outside class, right? That's one way that we normally advise if your schedule isn't quite as rigorous, but you know you can handle a more rigorous schedule, right? So you could sign up for one of our UCR classes, get some college credits that way, okay? And that way your overall profile looks more competitive. One of the key things you need to be aware of is that outside coursework does not necessarily need to be put into your college app, or sorry, your high school transcript, right? You can go ahead and submit a transcript directly from an outside source and have it count as part of your application, even if it never got formally put into your high school application. Okay, so next question is, if we took the SAT but chose not to submit the score, would it negatively affect the admission? Well, no, like I said, schools are test optional, which means if you chose to go test optional for that school, they won't even know, right? They don't know the record of how you did. Okay, and the follow-up to that question is, to apply for UC Berkeley, UCLA, and some Ivy, do you suggest to apply to SAT score around 1450? It's a little low, in my opinion. I would say if you want to be competitive for UC Berkeley and UCLA, 1500 at least, and if you want to be competitive for the Ivies, you want 1550 at least. Okay, to be competitive, right? It's not like you can't apply, but that's generally what we've seen in previous years to be, you know, viewed as a strong candidate for those schools. Okay, next one. How about environmental science? Is it a competitive major? Competitive in the sense that it's difficult. It depends on the school again, right? A lot of these questions are largely based on how strong the school is for things like environmental science. But in general, because there's not as many people applying for environmental science, it can actually be potentially an easier major to get into, right? So one example is UC Berkeley. In previous years, maybe not so much as it was in the past, but they had a unique college called the College of Natural Resources, which is where they house things like environmental science or environmental studies. And in the past, environmental science did have a slightly easier acceptance rate than, say, for example, if you're going for biology or chemistry, okay? All right, so the next question is, how many APs should a student take if the high school only provides 4 APs? Well, then you should try to take all 4 APs if you can, right? But in general, it's largely contextual based on how many APs are available to your high school, okay? If your high school does not offer enough APs, we highly recommend that you look outside of your school to supplement the coursework, okay? Next, if I'm taking a college course this semester, do you know if an A- and A's are weighted differently for college classes? Well, yeah, it depends on the actual college you're applying to. The UCs only really look at solid letter grades, which means if it's an A-, it still counts as an A for the UCs. Okay, for private schools, they will just take a look at it based on what you have. So obviously an A would look slightly better than an A-, but there's sort of like a little bit of a gulf between an A- and a B+, right? So psychologically, an A- is still closer in their minds to an A, and a B plus is still closer to a B in their minds. So as much as possible, as long as you can keep within that A or A minus side of things, you're going to be better off. Okay. Next one is, does it do more harm than good if I submit my 480 SAT score to Ivy Leagues and top 20 colleges? That's sort of in the range where it's maybe slightly on the neutral. It depends on your grades, right? If you have like straight A's, you haven't gotten a single B yet, then there might be a strategic reason why you may not want to go ahead and submit the 1480, even if it's by all accounts pretty solid. For Ivies though, it may not necessarily be up to their normal standards, right? In terms of if you look at their 25th to 75th percentile, a 1480 might be on a slightly lower end for like a top Ivy especially, okay? So I would say just looking at that, if you're applying to say, for example, a UPenn or a Yale, probably if you're getting straight A's, just don't send the SAT, okay? It might actually help your chances, weirdly enough, okay? But if you're applying to other top 20 schools, like if you're applying to like, say, for example, like a Rice or maybe like a WashU St. Louis, yeah, 1480 might actually be pretty decent, okay? Next one, if I already took the SAT, but I don't want to submit on my application because it's optional, will it impact my chances of getting into competitive colleges? Well, that's what test optional means, right? If they are saying that they are test optional, it's not going to harm you if you don't submit it, right? So they've been on record as saying if you choose not to submit it, they will just evaluate you based on the other factors. And this year more than ever, if you do feel like your SATs aren't going to necessarily help your case, then you may want to just go ahead and consider possibly going test optional. However, try first because there's still going to be plenty of opportunities, especially if you're not a senior right now. If you're a sophomore or junior, there's still plenty of test dates available. Your first option should still be to try to get the highest possible score before you decide to go test optional. Okay. Next one, what's the number of APs that I should take to be recognizable by top colleges? My high school offers a lot. So Heidi, it really all depends. I would say, they really just want to see you taking full advantage of APs when you can, right? So it's really a balancing act. It depends on how well you've done for previous semesters. There's not a set number because there's so much variance in the high schools out there in terms of how many were offered. But I would say in my experience, a typically strong, say, junior year would be someone who's maybe taking something like 4 or 5 APs, right, for most high schools. That's a fairly competitive range to be able to kind of like be in that competitive range for like top 20, top 15 universities, okay? And then for senior year, if you can take another 3 or 4 APs, that's kind of like the norm that I've seen for the students who are getting to those top schools. Okay, especially if your high school does offer a lot. That's kind of what I would say. But it's all very contextual. It's all very individualized. So that's definitely something where I think counseling can help, because then a counselor can help you, advise you in terms of whether or not you should push to take harder classes or whether or not you should scale back to balance it out so you can get better grades. Okay. All right, let me hop into the chat box a little bit. If you have any new questions, please type it into the question and answer box instead. But I just want to see if there's anything I omitted here. All right, so Jennifer asks, the news said that there are many high school graduates planning to take a gap year to COVID-19. Will that affect the acceptance rate in the following 2 years? Yes, it does, but remember, so one side of things is that the people who were seniors who took a gap year, they're going to be included in this coming class. But don't forget that there are students this year as well who are also going to be interested in taking a gap year for next year because they're not sure whether or not COVID will be resolved by then. So in a way, it's sort of like a shifting. So it's not really going to be something where the acceptance rate goes sky high, or neither will be like something that'll hurt students because of the number of students who are taking the gap year, right? So there's also the factor of you're thinking of like the number of international students who are not applying anymore because they're afraid to come to the US. So I would still say, in my opinion, based on my experiences, that there may still be a net increase in the acceptance rate of many top colleges this year. Okay, because they're far more likely to be, more on the cautious side of wanting to accept more students and then just waiting and seeing how the classes unfold. So they're going to err on the side of accepting more, in my opinion, because they're aware that some students may continue to take gap years as a result. Okay, they already know how many students did say that they're going to take a gap year, so they've already factored that in terms of their yield rate for the upcoming class. But having said that, they're still going to want to compensate for that by maybe accepting a few more students than they have done in previous years. Okay, so how many times can a student take an SAT? How do you report multiple scores? Well, there's really no cap technically, but there have been some studies that show that after a while, if you've taken 4, 5, or 6, it's kind of subject to diminishing returns where students don't improve anymore. So it's best to really space it out. So I would say if you took the SAT 2, 3, maybe 4 times as an upper limit, I think that's still pretty good because many schools will allow you to use something called score choice, where you can report just the scores you want them to see. So it's not like they will see all the other testing that you had earlier. And you can ignore a lot of the myths out there that say like, oh, I heard that they start averaging your test scores once you've taken a certain number of tests. They don't do that. I've never heard of a single admissions officer who's confirmed to me that they've done that, okay? Colleges will still look at you and evaluate you based on your highest overall sitting, okay, or highest overall test date, right? But at the same time, of course, it still looks slightly better if you're only showing them the highest possible score because they're humans, they'll see everything, right? So if they saw that you've taken multiple tests and your highest possible score was a byproduct of you taking it multiple times, that might very subtly affect their judgment of your scores versus if they only saw like one high score and that's the only thing they see, they might think that that might have been like more just like your natural ability level. Okay. If a student takes the SAT the summer of 8th grade, is it going to be recorded? Unfortunately, no, because they're only going to be evaluating your tests that you took during the high school years. But there are exceptions. You can actually write to College Board to keep the score on your record if you wished, right? So like if you had an unusually talented 8th grader who got like 1570 in 8th grade, you could just write to College Board and say like, hey, I'd like to keep that test on file, please. And they will do that for you, okay? But by default, it refreshes by the time you get into high school, okay? Next question is, if my senior year first semester GPA does not come out until college apps are due this year, would those grades still really matter? Yes, of course, right? Keep in mind that that's part of the normal cycle of admissions, right? First semester grades still count for schools that are due January 1st because they won't actually be making those decisions until like February or even March, right? So they will wait for supporting documents. Your counselor at your high school will send in something called a mid-year report, which includes all your first semester grades, which should make it to all the colleges that you're applying to by late January, which still gives them more than ample time to evaluate your senior year grades. So yes, very much so, right? Don't be mistaken by thinking that first semester senior year grades don't count, because that would be a very tragic mistake if you started getting bad grades because they see them, okay? Now, maybe not for the UCs because they don't consider 12th grade at all, but they still consider which courses you took, which means they'll still be making judgments based on how well you did overall, which courses you took and how challenging they were. But at the same time, there's also that risk of if you did really poorly 12th grade, that could come back to haunt you because that could also be something that could cause them to rescind or revoke your admissions. So if you did really poorly senior year, even first semester, and you started getting C's and D's, that could be a reason for why even if they accepted you come March, April, May, they could very well just yank it back in June and said like, hey, you didn't live up to the type of student we thought we were accepting, right? So once they ask you for your final transcript, which they do, if it doesn't live up to what they expected of you, that can still come back and really hurt you. So yes, I still really want you to consider senior year as a vital part of your application. Okay, so I have time for one last question, and this is does the special situation this year benefit international students? Well, in some ways, yes, right? Because if there's gonna be a drop-off in the number of international students, there are certain schools, for instance, that do want international students to be able to kind of like add to the diversity of campus. But there's also the self-serving fact that yes, some colleges do want international students because they can charge them more than they would for a domestic student or for like an in-state student. So it does present a unique opportunity if you're an international student. It might actually help you benefit from more generous acceptance rates because there are fewer applicants this year. Okay, so just one last question, and then this will be it, okay? How about 8th grade summer activities? Is it considered part of the high school activity record? It's a complicated question. It technically counts, I guess, as part of the Common App if it's after 8th grade, okay? But it does not count for the UCs because the UCs count the summer after the year, whereas College Board or Common App counts the summers before, which is kind of a weird quirk of the application process. So any activities that you did the summer before 9th grade for Common App will count. For the UCs, it doesn't count, okay? All right, so thank you so much for attending our seminar. I hope you found it informative. Okay. If you have any other questions, we highly advise that you contact your local HS2 branch, and we can set up a free consultation session for you, and you can find out whether or not HS2 is right for you or your child. Okay. All right. So thank you for attending today's seminar. Okay. And hope you have a great rest of the weekend, and stay safe, stay healthy.